This week we talk about the brain and cognitive functioning. So the chapter starts out talking about the brain and brain basics. And any of you who've taken a physiology class, this is pretty basic stuff. But essentially, it starts out with the triune part of the brain, the three pieces taking the slice this way. Um, and the brain stem survival is the fight or flight. It's the part that the adrenaline gets rolling, whether there's a threat to us or not, and it kicks in chemically and with brain synaptic processes to get us out of danger. This, and by the way, all of these are connected so that there are different connections back and forth. The limbic brain, the emotional center of the brain, which is protected by the neocortex, or the higher order thinking area. So these two are definitely connected, and one of the things that comes out of your chapter is about, and I'm not sure that I learned this in physiology class way back when, but that the emotion or that limbic brain is actually a filter, if you will, for how we perceive or how things might be stored in short and long-term memory in the neocortex. In other words, depending on our mood, we may or may not put things into our brain the same way each time. And in fact, it might be associated with a positive. We're having a very good day and things are going in the way they should, and the way, actually, when I say should, the way that the teacher or instructor intends for it to happen, then all is good, probably can be recalled later. But if there's some sort of negative thing going on, the emotions are basically almost acting as a really tight filter, almost a switch. Then things aren't going in and being processed or stored, if you will, in our long-term memory for recall later, or when they are recalled, they're recalled in a very negative way. So I really liked how your chapter very briefly summed up how emotions are linked to higher order thinking and all that gray matter that goes on in the neocortex. But I wanted to learn more because I thought what was really interesting was about Jill Taylor, who had a stroke. And I actually had a colleague who had a stroke. She was 43 years old, and her stroke resulted in some physical motor skills and speech. And I just remember she was able to write very rudimentary because she also had her motor skills were impaired. But her doctor explained it this way. She knows everything that's going on in her mind. She just can't communicate back to you. So in other words, she understands everything completely, but is almost like uh, wants to get it out, but there's no way for that brain to make that connection and get the words out to communicate, or even writing in this case, because of her, it had affected her motor skills. There was no way. So how would that be to be inside of your mind and have the full faculties of thinking and understanding what people were saying to her? Her auditory senses were just fine, but not being able to react to it. I can't even imagine that level of frustration. So when I read in your book, in your text about Jill Taylor, whose stroke occurs on her left hemisphere, had language and analytical abilities were impaired. This is very much like this colleague of mine. She writes, when I lost my left hemisphere and its language centers, I also lost the clock that would break my moments into consecutive brief instances. And I read that sentence several times because I lost the ability I lost the clock that would break my moments into consecutive brief instances, those things that we really think about at certain moments. I shifted from the doing consciousness of my left brain, I'm going to get something done, to the being consciousness of my right brain. Now, your text doesn't go into much detail about the left and right. It basically does the triune part of the brain, which was one of the reasons that I wanted to go and get this graphic, which, by the way, is a little bit blurry. And you can see here that one of the nice things, it's got different pieces marked. But you can find it online and maybe zoom in a little bit closer if you like by just Googling this in the image area, anatomy and functional areas of the brain. And there's probably other diagrams as well. But what I really liked about it is that she said on her left side, she had lost speech. Well, on the left side, we see this number 4, which is down here low, and that's the muscles of speech. And so I just wanted to see what those kinds of things look like. Now, keep in mind things are passing left to right, but there's also some connective tissue that goes back and forth. I stopped thinking in language and shifted to taking new pictures of what was going on in the present moment. The right hemisphere strength is nonverbal, more holistic, pictorial, and spatial. Damage to this side of the brain may result in not being able to interpret the nonverbal emotional content of a message. So I just think that that's really interesting that different parts of our brain do different things, and that it's only been really in the last 50 years or so that we've been able to pinpoint in more detail where those kinds of things are occurring. So when someone says they have a stroke or a brain injury or concussion, and depending on where they've been hit, you can almost say, well, that's going to impact blank. So there's a kind of an interesting thought about the brain. Talk a little bit about in that passage about the left and right brain. And I've used this graphic before. And you've heard this. I am a left brain. I'm the logic, accurate, analytical type, uh, control, science, realistic. And then on the right, I am right-brained. Thou art poetry, freedom, passion, vivid, creative, yearning, and peace. One of the things that I found in preparing for this short little lecture here was that on the right side of our brain, even though we like to think of in terms of athletic prowess, if we think of athletes, we always think, oh, they're very specific, they're very deliberate, they've turned their game into something that's very strategic, they've turned it into a science. In reality, most neuroscientists would say that's all true for the understanding of a game. But when they're actually engaging in a game, more of the side that actually gets the most use is the creativity or the passion. It's actually more fluid and emotional, the right side of the brain. So those two sides, the left side controls the important types of thinking such as language, logic, critical thinking, and reasoning. If you think back to Jill Taylor's example, that language part was really impaired. Critical thinking, where she lost those instances, what did she say? Consecutive, she lost her moments into consecutive and lost her consecutive brief instances. Those are really critical for how we do critical thinking. You have to have those little pieces to bring it back up and then kind of mull it over, if you will, and put it into some sort of context. That's the left side brain, the analytic. The right side is much better at creative and expressive tasks such as reactive movements and motor skills. Again, the athlete may know where they need to be, position on the field, body, so on. But on the right side is where it's all going to take place, where the real connections are going to need to work and come together. So what does this mean for learning? Well, we have to take a look at the brain, and we've talked a lot about learning theories, and this is a question actually in the discussion. We've looked at learning theories. But now, how does that square with what we know about the brain? And obviously, there's been different parts of the brain that we are really trying to influence, and hopefully people come in an emotional state where they are ready to learn. If not, we probably have to deal with that part first. It's kind of like going back to Maslow, if you will. We have this hierarchy of needs. We have to meet those basic needs before we're actually in a position where we can work with the neocortex. This is where we connect to prior learning. This is where we connect with our senses. Remember those senses being the senses that we touch, no pun intended, but the maximum amount of senses that we touch, whether it is the feeling, the hearing, the seeing, the tasting, the smelling, all those kinds of things then are part of what goes into the brain. They are sensory stimuli, and they can go into this neocortex area to be recalled later. It can be influenced by the limbic system, the emotional part, as an interpreter, as I already mentioned. Working memory. This is the part that you're encoding, you're doing some filtering. It's the part that's kind of right there quickly where you're kind of deciding where you're going to store this content or this understanding. Adults use a filter or remove irrelevant and confusing information. I thought that was really interesting, is that perhaps with younger children, everything kind of comes in. They don't have enough experience to decide what's irrelevant. They may have enough experience to know what's confusing. And that's where we say, well, we do some formative assessment and they don't understand this, so we reteach it. But they don't really get the irrelevant. But for adults, where everything has to have a lot of meaning, it may be perceived as irrelevant or confusing information, and therefore I'm throwing it away. I'm not going to store it into my working memory. It's not going to get encoded. It's not going to go into long-term memory. And when you look at long-term memory, they divided this up into a few sections: procedural and habituated, cognitive and motor skills. I think we all know that there are things that we can do with our bodies that are habitual, and our mind does not have to be engaged in exactly what we're doing it because we've done it 1,000 times. Some people call this muscle memory. But essentially, if you clean house and you've scrubbed toilets or you've done dishes, you can think about anything else, and you will still be able to have that cognitive motor skill that gets the house clean. Unfortunately, a lot of us get into this procedural habituated kind of thought, if you will, or memory when driving. And we might be thinking everything's quite happened. We are actually so far away from the focus of driving that we might get into an accident. So sometimes that's actually, we have to concentrate, bring our thoughts back to the task at hand, which in this case is driving, which is really like having a hurling bullet going down the road. There are other things that we do, and I talked about muscle memory, athletics, for example. If you've done a sport and had a repeated type of action that you do several times over, it's just habit. If you have swung a bat, if you have, I play hockey, so the actual skating with a puck, I don't think about skating anymore. I just do it. I'm thinking about something else now. And those are the procedural or habituated type of activities. Episodic, that's our senses and our feelings that go in along with it in terms of our long-term memory. And remember, those can be act as filters. And actually, as we bring them forth, we might say, well, I remember that, but it's a bad memory. That's what we're talking about here with feelings and senses. The semantic, knowledge and facts that are connected to experience, and they have to have meaning. So here's the problem. What we talk a lot about standardized exams and so forth. If we're just taking an exam, we're asking kids or any kind of student to repeat facts, specific knowledge or content. If that's not connected to an experience and doesn't have meaning, it's probably not going to be stored in long-term memory. If it's something you feel that they have to know absolutely as a fact, then make it meaningful so it can be stored and then recovered or brought forward later and transferred into a different situation. The rest of your chapter talks then about intelligence. And in fact, I've given you a video this week. In fact, several of the authors that are discussed in your text are on this video, Sternberg and a few others. Gardner's on this video as well. It talks about the different types of intelligence and how they were measuring, and it talks a lot about the IQ test and what that measures. But your text talks about, in particular, these measuring ways to measure intelligence in addition to the IQ test. I should have said that, in addition to the IQ test. Fluid and crystallized intelligence, Gardner's, Sternberg's triarchtic theory of intelligence, and Goldman's emotional intelligence, which are all touched on in the video that I found for you this week. And finally, the cognitive development and wisdom was kind of the last section of the chapter, which I really enjoyed reading. We talk about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And if you understood what we just talked about in terms of long-term memory and meaning, there's knowledge and facts that get stored, but how is wisdom any different? But cognitive development is about how thinking patterns change as we age. Wisdom, this is a great quote from your chapter, from your text. Wisdom appears to be related to the situation rather than the person, and that cognitive variables, personality variables, and life experiences are more important than age in the development of wisdom. We've all known people where we've said, boy, they're wise beyond their years. But what your text is pointing out is that there are cognitive variables, there's personality variables, and experiences that are going to weigh into wisdom. It just so happens that the older we get, the more of these variables we have. Maybe not personality variables, but we definitely have more life experiences and more cognitive variables, things that we have learned along the way and filed in that long-term storage. And so we often associate wisdom with age. I also heard a quote recently where I think some of you have probably heard this. Wisdom, and the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that a tomato does not belong in a fruit salad. And so that's personality, no. It's cognitive variable, yeah, we've thought about that. And then life experiences, it just doesn't go together. So it's not really a function so much of age, but definitely age can contribute to the notion or to the concept of wisdom.